Hi, we're back again with our Hexagon of Heresy. In our first video in this little sub-series, we looked at Ebionism and Docetism, which they are, respectively, the denial of Jesus' full divinity and the denial of Jesus' full humanity. I hope you've had a chance to go and take a look at our third main Christological heresy of history when you went back and reviewed the video on the Arian controversy. Today we want to look at the fourth heresy of Christian history, which is a reintroduction of Ebionism in a more sinister form, which is Apollinarianism. Now, the first councils of the Christian church were convened to deal with Arianism and Apollinarianism. The Council of Nicaea in 325 was convened to deal with Arianism, but it didn't fully settle the issue. It just stated what the church believed, but then that all had to be worked out and reunited among great theologians such as Athanasius and the Cappadocians. Arianism was still the main issue in the Council of Constantinople in 381. But also Apollinarianism was an issue there too. But before we talk about Apollinarianism itself, I want to look at a couple of major cities in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Greek Empire at that time, because the capital had been moved. And I want to look at their differing approaches to Christology because it's the background behind the problem that is going on. The two cities are Alexandria and Antioch. The two of the largest cities in the empire, as well as the two most theologically influential. Yes, they were more important than Rome in those days. And each one had a theological school. Now, not like a seminary or a university, but they had a distinctive approach in how they taught theology, how they reflected upon God, that by the time we get into the 4th century, there were growing gaps between Alexandria and Antioch. Now, let's explain those so that we can make this make sense. The Alexandrian school from Alexandria in Egypt wanted to preserve the divinity of Jesus. That was their main goal, was to keep Jesus divine. They sometimes de-emphasized his humanity. Sometimes deity won over humanity. Remember all the way back at the beginning of our discussion of Christology, when we looked at methodology. Do we start from below? Do we start from above? Well, definitely the Alexandrians began from above, because for them, Jesus' divinity was the overriding factor, which is understandable because he is the eternal Word made flesh. While they never really lost Jesus' humanity, they would certainly err toward the side of divinity. They were more important, they were more interested in preserving his divinity than they were in preserving his humanity, even though they didn't want to completely abandon his humanity. So we've got the Alexandrians who leaned heavily toward Jesus' divinity. Now, on the other hand, in Syria was the city of Antioch. Antioch wanted to preserve them both. They wanted to ensure that the actions of the God-man were genuinely human actions. We tend to be more like Antioch as Protestants than Alexandria. We tend to want to preserve Jesus' humanity, sometimes at the expense of his deity, whereas the Alexandrians wanted to preserve his deity, sometimes at the expense of his humanity. And so these cities had a differing approach. They were the two main theological cities of the empire. They were very influential as major sees or major areas of church government, and they were rival cities. Each one wanted to one up the other. And once you have all of that going on at once, you've got a recipe for disaster. We'll see that happen in the 5th century heresies of Nestorianism and Monophysitism. But first we have Apollinarianism. Now, Apollinarius was from Alexandria. Now, we just got through saying that the Alexandrians would preserve Jesus' divinity. And Apollinarius, who lived in the 350s, 360s, 370s, was a staunch supporter of Nicene orthodoxy, committed Trinitarian. So all was right on that side of the fence. He ran into trouble when he began teaching that Jesus had a fully human body, but his soul and mind were replaced by the Logos. In other words, in Jesus Christ, we have a fully human body, but that human body is indwelt by a mind and soul that itself is divine. So he does not have a human mind or a human soul. He has a divine mind and a divine soul. So therefore, under Apollinarianism, he is not fully human. He's partly human, but not fully. He lacked the immaterial parts of humanity, the soul, the spirit, the mind, the will, the emotions, all those things that all of us as human beings possess. According to Apollinarius, Jesus did not have, or at least did not have them as a human. He had them as God, and just put on a human body. Well, the Council at Constantinople condemned this teaching of Apollinarius. It said, under no uncertain terms, that Jesus was fully and completely human, as well as being fully and completely divine. Constantinople was presided over by one of the greatest theologians in the history of Christianity, Gregory of Nazianzus, who was very famous in his theological orations on the Trinity, but he was also a staunch supporter of Jesus' humanity. And at the council, Gregory uttered, he uttered it and he wrote it, one of the most famous phrases of Christian history, and that is, the unassumed is the unhealed. And what Gregory meant by that is that if Jesus is not fully human, then humans can't be fully healed of the disease of sin. If as Apollinarius taught, Jesus is only human by means of his body, but not by means of his mind, then Jesus cannot heal the human mind in his incarnation, death, and resurrection. That the human mind remains untouched by Jesus because he did not assume it. If Jesus does not have a fully human soul, then Jesus' work does not touch the human soul. The human soul is left out there to be unhealed by the atoning work of Jesus Christ. And that's why the early church saw Apollinarianism as a real problem, because the unassumed is the unhealed. So by 381, by the end of the Council of Constantinople, the church had fully agreed that Jesus is fully divine and fully human, very God of very God and very man of very man. Now, how these two relate to one another is a subject of the 5th century and the heresies contained therein. I think I'm going to break this off right now and make that its own separate video because it may take a little while. So we'll be back in just a moment with the 5th century and the last 2 heresies on our hexagon. We've already done Ebionism, Docetism, Arianism, and Apollinarianism. Now we're going to look at the heresies of how the human and the divine interrelate in Jesus in Nestorianism and Monophysitism. Be right back. Hang on tight. See you later.